James Bond has a long history of video games and a long history of those games being left to rot on their respective hardware, with almost no effort by anyone in an official capacity to keep these games alive or available to fans. These games, from Nintendo 64 to PlayStation 2 to even the PS3 and Xbox 360 generations, have really never been brought up to later platforms for gamers to enjoy, being forgotten in all official capacities, as often happens with licensed games and properties. James Bond, his movies, his games, and his media are a topic that I really enjoy, that I want to talk about more on my channel because I am a big fan. So before we hop into today's video, which is about video game preservation and media preservation, if you enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you back in the future because we got a long road ahead of us in 2023, and I hope to keep growing the audience and having a fun time. When it comes to gaming preservation, I know some fans and gamers think it's good enough that emulation can fix a lot of these issues while preserving the games digitally, but emulation isn't actually always a perfect solution, which is something that we'll get into later on in the video. It also becomes much harder for people to do as the games get newer, with not everyone having a PC that can effectively emulate something like a PlayStation 3 game. It's also worth noting that many of these games can experience glitches or imperfections due to being forced to run on system architecture that they weren't actually designed for on the PC. A popular game like Metal Gear Solid 4 is actually a great example of this. That PlayStation 3 game was only stabilized through emulation in more recent years, becoming fully playable in 2019 on PC due to a ton of fan effort in the emulation community, which is worth note because the game originally released all the way back in 2008. So that's a lot of years for a game to be stuck only on the PS3. Emulation took a long time to solve this issue, which is no fault of those who worked on perfecting it because there was no official support to actually get MGS4 on newer hardware or even release it officially on the PC. I also want to add that I don't think the fans and gamers themselves should be the ones who have to step in and fix a problem and preserve everything. Whether someone likes these games or a studio cares about these releases from their past or not, I still believe that these are pieces of gaming history that deserve to be preserved and played by the widest amount of gamers possible. People don't have to go back and play them, but I think that they should have an easier option to do so. And this doesn't just apply to James Bond, but I think James Bond is a perfect example of it because its license really makes it so that nobody ever really tries to keep these games alive. It frustrates me greatly that the idea of gaming preservation and media preservation in general is not only not respected by most rights holders now of these properties, but also so many corporations have convinced a loud portion of the gaming community that gaming should be this throwaway, fast food-like experience that doesn't need any preservation and shouldn't be revisited at later dates. I find this odd, especially because people feel the opposite way of movies, with movie connoisseurs going back to watch movies from the 1950s. It's odd to me that people aren't willing to put that same effort into demanding these games actually be preserved. Some are, but a lot aren't. But this attitude of play the disposable game and move on, never to return because it's old, it's outdated, the controls aren't as good, there's something better. That's an attitude that I think is becoming far too common in gaming. And not only does it lead to a lack of preserved games, it also leads to bad releases now. It leads to lazy games that come out, not even because of the developers, but because of the rights holders or the corporate figureheads above them that push developers to release a game quickly with a ton of problems, sort of fix it later, but by the time it's actually good or competent, people have moved on to something else because it was a disposable experience. There's no point to go back. This idea plagues the world of 007 video games, some of which are surprisingly great games, some of which are fairly mediocre, and a few of which are just not good, but still deserve preservation. James Bond's video games date all the way back to 1993, and there was an unofficial game made before this named Shaken Not Stirred, but it's not really counted since it wasn't actually an official licensed game. The first game, James Bond 007, was released all the way back on the Atari 2600, 5200, and the 8-bit family along with the Commodore 64 and ColecoVision. Emulation mostly solves the issue of these games being lost to time, as the files are out there, and for the most part, these games do work relatively easy on pretty much any computer. You don't need a dedicated gaming rig to run Atari 2600 games. It's pretty dang easy. The real issue with game preservation starts to arise though when we reach games like GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64. Now this game was only ever officially released on the N64, which is pretty old at this point. There's nothing wrong with that console. I think it's really fun and awesome, But let's be honest, a lot of people don't have one or access to one, and like all hardware, the machine can age and fail, and it's getting old. There's really no reason that this game has to stay on that architecture forever. There is a version of the game coming to the Xbox Game Pass and to Nintendo Switch Online, but the preservation issue with this is that you still need a membership to access it, and it is digital through the internet. Now, I don't blame anyone for not knowing this part, but the rights issues around GoldenEye 007 are really complex, with the game itself falling under the jurisdiction of Microsoft and Nintendo, but the James Bond brand falling under the jurisdiction of MGM. This means you have to get a lot of groups to get along and work together in order for a re-release to come out. With this game being locked behind membership criteria and access to the internet, there's actually no guarantee that it won't eventually become unavailable again to modern gamers or the general public like it has been pretty much for years, unless you're willing to buy a Nintendo 64 or try your hand at emulating the game, which is very doable. There were so many fan attempts to remake or remaster this game that got shut down by rights holders over the years, and it's worth pointing out that there was even an official remastered version of this game created by Rare that was uncovered for the Xbox 360 arcade that never made it to market. Supposedly this happened because this completed remaster was blocked by Bond licensors like Don Jacques and Eon. I think I said the name right, but sorry if I didn't. It was reported that Rare tried to get permission to release it for their game, Rare Replay, but was also blocked from doing so. So as an aside, I find this really ridiculous because its release wouldn't have actually taken away from any of the games coming out at the time of the Xbox 360, because the Daniel Craig games are just so different from that era of GoldenEye 007. It was a vastly different type of game, and Rare Replay later would come out during the Xbox One and PS4 era, where there are 0 007 games. So regardless, there's nothing to really be affected. All it would have been is free promotion for the 007 brand, which was still releasing movies and games at this time. If you have a PC, you could theoretically, somebody could seek the remaster out. It's technically out there on the internet, and it does allegedly run pretty much perfectly on the correct emulation software. So there is that, and there are plenty of videos online about this remaster. Now, I know what some of you are going to say for this game and for later games. There's plenty of Nintendo 64 and other emulators that work fine, and Jay, you said that emulation solved a lot of the issues of the old Atari era or ColecoVision era of Bond games, so why not here? While this is true, and I do believe that to an extent, a lot of games don't fully work through emulation without messing around with settings and doing back-end stuff that you really shouldn't have to do in order to play a game that was completed years ago. Yes, it's awesome that you can. Yes, it's awesome that people have kept it preserved and fans have done it. But the truth with emulation that many people don't want to admit, especially for newer games, is that it relies on the passion and dedication of tons of super intelligent fans in the emulation community who are usually trying to get these games to work for free just because of their passion, without a salary, without a paycheck, on hardware that the games were not designed for. This can actually lead to a lot of problems with games, like we mentioned with Metal Gear Solid 4, because of this, which is something we're going to touch on even more later in the video with some specific 007 games. Now, on top of that, the better your PC, especially as these games get newer, the more likely you are to get your emulated games to run well, which means that the worse your PC is, the less likely you are. That's just kind of a given thing. With the N64 era, at least you don't need a ton of processing power, but as we get further on into the 3D era, it locks a lot of people out of high performance emulation who don't have a dedicated beefy PC that's built for gaming. Players also often have to mess around with controller support depending on the game and other features that may not translate perfectly to a change in hardware on the computer. GoldenEye 007 is at least mostly stable with emulators, but I will admit that even I had some issues getting it to run on certain emulators. It does work much better on others, but when I first set it up, I had to do a lot of finessing and finicking around to get past things like shot effect glitches when you shoot someone and other stuff going on, and I have a pretty beefy PC. Now, that doesn't mean that none of the emulation works, and my PC is not the newest thing out there. It did not roll off the line and was built yesterday, but it's been built in the past few years, and it is a gaming PC I built by myself through hard work and money, and even that level of power can't always make up for some known glitches or errors when emulating certain games on certain emulators. Some of these are Bond games, which we're going to look at today as well. The Electronic Arts era of Bond games is where it starts to get even messier for accessibility to Bond titles. Games like Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough were released for the PlayStation, which emulation on PC does preserve fairly well, but there are a couple of caveats. First off, when it comes to console owners, if you don't own a PS1, PS2, or PS3, you're not going to be able to play these games. PS4 and PS5 don't play them. They just don't do the backwards compatibility. It's a case-by-case digital thing. For example, the PS2 on PS4 program, on the PlayStation 4 of course, and obviously as well the Xbox One and Xbox Series consoles backwards compatibility programs, which are actually kind of, I guess I would say, kneecapped a little bit by rights issues. It's annoying because these games were never brought up to anything, they were never put on any Xbox architecture due to the licensing, and the only reason they're playable on the PlayStation 2 and 3 is the built-in backwards compatible emulation feature where you can put a PS1 disc in and play it on those generations. That feature is no longer available on newer hardware. Like I said, backwards compatibility is pretty much limited to rights issues and licensing issues, and it's more of a case-by-case basis on systems like the Xbox Series consoles. And it's also worth noting that not all versions of these 007 games are even the same. So for example, the Nintendo 64 version of The World Is Not Enough is actually considered far better than the PlayStation version of that game, with both being developed by entirely different studios. But the PlayStation version is the only one even remotely available to more modern console users, assuming they have a PS3, 2, or 1. The Nintendo 64 version of The World Is Not Enough, which is considered the better version, is locked on just the Nintendo 64 or to emulation. So there's no official way to actually play this game on any modern hardware, and the only reason it's been preserved at all is due to dedicated fans who are awesome in the emulation community who actually care about making games available to users after the initial release date, which is something I wish the rights holders for properties like this would care more about and do more to preserve, because I think licenses like the 007 license pretty much print money, especially when the game is already done and could be re-released. I don't understand the point of not splitting revenue when you're going to get no revenue from not re-releasing something at all. When we reach the PlayStation 2, original Xbox, and Nintendo GameCube generation, which is one of the most popular generations of gaming, we have games like Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, and Everything or Nothing, which, by the way, that game, Everything or Nothing, is a third-person shooter far ahead of its time, in my opinion. This was long before the years of Gears of War and other, mainstay third-person shooters that had really kind of perfected cover systems and other things. Games like this that were ahead of their time are still lost to time because of these issues. There were other titles like From Russia with Love, where they actually got Sean Connery back to play Bond again, and a very fascinating third-person shooter version of the Quantum of Solace game. These games are another beast entirely. None of them have ever been brought up to newer systems after this generation, with the exception of Quantum of Solace, which is kind of all over the place. There's like 50 versions of this thing. Not really, it's probably like 5. But it did release on the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation as well, officially. That said, Quantum's a very odd and specific case because this game was released on things like the PS2, which was developed by an entirely separate studio, and it's a totally different genre of game, being a third-person shooter. It was also ported to the Nintendo Wii, which is more like the version on the 360, and then of course there was the 360 and PS3 version, which were pretty much the same version, a first-person shooter with third-person cover elements that was, designed by another studio, not the PlayStation 2 game studio. The PS2 is an annoying beast and problem child in the emulation community as well, with lots of games having issues with emulation, and the only machine that played PS2 discs other than the PS2 officially was the PS3, and it was the version of the PS3 that suffered from the yellow light of death. Now, this PS3 console was discontinued and fetches a pretty penny on sites like eBay, and while it does work well to play PS2 games, there's really not many problems with that. This console has so many issues in terms of its longevity that gamers have pretty much all conceded that it will break down and need servicing at some point. The best bet to get one of these is to pay $400 and get one with new thermal paste installed in the machine, or some kind of external mod to actually change the fan speed to avoid overheating, because Sony didn't really bother to fix this machine, it just revamped the PS3 and re-released it after these failures. The GameCube releases of this generation are at least playable on the Wii because the Wii does have backwards compatibility with GameCube discs, but the Wii's no spring chicken itself. It's not exactly new, but it is the closest to game preservation there is with Bond. Nintendo surprisingly did the best with this with the Wii and Wii U, because plenty of people still have a Wii sitting around at the very least at their house. I will say that while Wii games are also playable on the Wii U, that only solves a fraction of this problem, as the Wii U can't play GameCube games, and the Wii can only output in composite cable, which we're going to talk about in a minute, unless you get external devices to change that. However, only games like GoldenEye on the Wii or Quantum of Solace's Wii version are playable on the Wii U, because it's kind of like you can bring it up to the step of Nintendo after the previous generation, but not past that, and that ends when we get to the Switch. With the only Wii U games being on the Switch, re-releases that were just officially re-released. It doesn't have backwards compatibility, as they switched to a cartridge-based system, not a disc-based system. Games like Nightfire, it's worth noting, on the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, and also that did get a release on the PC, are pretty much just stuck where they are, with not every version being the same as well, with a lot of people saying the PC version is missing some of the better features found in console ports of Nightfire. Worth mentioning, this was back in the day when PC wasn't the exact standard all the time, and consoles were a lot more common than PC. Over time, things have changed, and now you generally want to see a pretty equal release on all platforms. If it's coming to PC, you want to see it as good or better because of the technology, just like it was on the other console platforms. That wasn't always the case back in this era. So it's also not as easy as just picking up a PC copy and thinking you've solved the issue either. Something I did want to talk about as well that I think a lot of people overlook with using the original hardware of a lot of these games is the issue of HDMI for console owners. Now, I know purists will buy CRT TVs. I have one myself. Mine's not very good. I need to replace it at some point. But many newer TVs, as in flat screen, HD, especially the 4K era or 8K era of TVs, no longer have the ability to play or accept composite cable inputs. Now, I might be talking nonsense to some of you because I know that some people in this audience are a little young, no offense meant, but I'm sure you've seen the older consoles with the color cords, like the red, white, and yellow cord that have the round end on them. You know, it looks like a little pokey thing. Well, a lot of TVs don't actually have slots to plug those in anymore. Some do, but a lot don't, because these composite cables are considered a thing of the past. Not only do gamers have to seek out these older systems to play these games officially through official means, but also the TV industry itself has moved on from those older consoles. For many TVs, you need to buy an HDMI adapter in order to force your retro consoles to output through HDMI if you want to play them on an HD TV, or you need to buy a composite cable box adapter, which can be a little expensive or be complete garbage depending on what you want to pay for it. Both of these solutions are actually imperfect, just as imperfect as emulation can be at times, depending on the game and console. So for example, the PS2, being a problem child with emulation, is also a bit of a problem child when it comes to HD TVs, as a lot of these adapters actually cause external noise effects with the games. They can mess up the aspect ratio, they can cause issues with sound in the games as well. The one I have causes issues with sound, and it wasn't even cheap, so I'm trying to replace it myself. But that's kind of what made me think of this video in general, was I wanted to research how available these games are, because it was so annoying for me to get the PS2 versions of these games actually running well. With no newer ports, remasters, or re-releases from that generation, which has some of the best Bond games like Nightfire and Everything or Nothing, the generation appears to have been fully abandoned by anyone at any official capacity. And it's really a shame too, since some of these games are fantastic. Nightfire and Everything or Nothing really stand out to me, with both featuring a really fun original story and the likeness of Pierce Brosnan, with him even returning to voice the role of Bond in Everything or Nothing. These are original licensed Bond stories that had a lot of love put into them, not found in any movie form, that are just inaccessible to play by a lot of fans of the character for really no good reason at all. Again, not splitting revenue, not re-releasing, not working out those contracts, and just making no more money off of it instead of being willing to share the money is what it comes off like to me. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One even showed that they were capable of backwards compatibility like I mentioned, but nobody at an official level actually bothered to release these games like this, Because, I don't know. Unfortunately, since there's no built-in plug-and-play feature of backwards compatibility in terms of these consoles themselves now, with it being more case by case, like you can't just pop in an original PS2 disc in a PS4 or an Xbox disc in an Xbox One and expect it to work. It had to be manually made backwards compatible. Companies like Microsoft aren't even at fault for this, neither are the developers. Because here's the thing, the developers can't go behind the back of the rights holders and re-release a game. They'll get sued. And Microsoft can't even go and make these games backwards compatible because it has to be done through digital patches that can't be done without the rights holders' permission through official channels. It's another case of needing to get everyone in the kitchen and get all parties on board, something that, as you can see, is not a common occurrence with James Bond games. Just because. Emulation does solve some of this, but it depends on the emulator and the PC you have. So for example, I wouldn't recommend trying to emulate some of the PS2 versions of the Brosnan games, unless you want a headache and have to deal with a lot of graphical and cutscene issues, with really only the GameCube versions of these games being super stable on PC, because the Dolphin emulator is just really good. Now with that said, it's still not an official solution. This is fans and emulation geniuses getting the game to actually work through their passion. My problem is that there's really no effort at any company level or corporate level or rights holder level to actually get these things happening. Now, some people might think, well, the developers are at fault, but like I said, they're not. They really can't do anything. They made the best game they could at the time with a lot of passion and did what they could. And after that license expires, it's up to the rights holders to actually get things moving again. If they don't, nothing happens. Now, what's really odd is that the developers who created these games actually did a lot to try and preserve the experiences of them. I already mentioned Rare wanting to redo GoldenEye and actually finishing a remaster of it officially and being told no, which is probably one of the douchiest things I've ever heard. But these developers added things like bots to the multiplayer modes of games like Agent Under Fire and Nightfire, which allows owners to still experience those multiplayers during the modern day, assuming they can access the game with the actual correct technology. This era did introduce a very bad precedent as well, though, at the very end of it, with Bond games, as the From Russia with Love title neglected to add bots to their multiplayer mode, citing that the game was meant to be social. This wasn't an isolated decision and would continue to pop up in the following Activision era of Bond games. There are also PC ports of some of these games, like Nightfire, like I said, but they don't always match up with the console versions of the game, with the Nightfire PC port in particular being considered inferior to the console release by a lot of gamers. These PC games were also made back when PC games were released as physical discs, so also over time they will become susceptible to the price gouging often found in the secondhand market as games get older. And if you don't believe that can happen, if you want a little fun research here, look up games like Rule of Rose on the PlayStation 2 or Haunting Grounds. Games can get really out of hand. Also games like Pokemon Emerald, Ruby, Sapphire, Leaf Green, Fire Red, Crystal, Gold, Silver. All those games are starting to go up and up in price if you want an official version of them. And it just sucks because this makes it so a lot of people can never play these games through official channels. It also really encourages emulation, so when gaming companies come out against it, it's a little ironic that they aren't doing much to push back and actually make the things available. The Activision era of Bond is an interesting one. Some people love it, some hate it. It is really just the Daniel Craig era of James Bond, and when Activision obtained the license to make these games, they made a lot of decisions that really frustrated people. The Activision titles focus less on the gadgetry of Bond and more on his combat abilities, which already started off on the wrong foot for a lot of people. However, this isn't a review of those games, and I will review these James Bond games over time. I really plan to, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. This is more of a look back at the current availability of all of these games. Quantum of Solace, GoldenEye Reloaded, and Bloodstone were all pretty much permanently abandoned by everyone. They came out on the PS3 and 360 generation. Again, Quantum of Solace came out pretty much everywhere, which we already talked about, but these games were never brought to newer consoles after that generation. This is something I'm sure you're used to hearing me say by now. Maybe I'm sounding like a broken record, getting a little annoying. I don't know, maybe you can method act me then, because it certainly annoys me. Now, you may think that plenty of 360 and PS3 games also came out on PC, and those games work great on PC. And you'd be absolutely right. That said, not every Bond game did, and those games were designed for PC. When trying to emulate PS3 or Xbox 360 games, you need a pretty powerful PC to make up for the fact that the games weren't intended to run there, making even the fan-made solution of preserving these games still imperfect. Now, if there are PC releases of some of these games like Quantum of Solace and Bloodstone, what's the problem? What's the problem, Jay? Well, the issue is that these are becoming harder and harder to find over time, and GoldenEye Reloaded never got one. That is a console exclusive game. These games, by the way, that do exist on PC, like Quantum and Bloodstone, they have also been delisted from all digital storefronts as Activision no longer has the license to distribute the games or make 007 games going forward. Now, not only are these Activision era games no longer available digitally, which is important because this was during the era where digital gaming was starting to be pushed, and everybody always says, Jay, digital gaming's the future. Jay, digital gaming means games will live forever. They'll always be available. This is a case of them, one, not being, but also the multiplayers for all of these respective games have been shut down over time at an official level, with none of them ever even including bots for this Activision era. Meaning, the only way to play some of these multiplayers now is through split-screen multiplayer, and that doesn't even solve all of it either, even if you wanted it to and you have a ton of friends. Maybe you have way more friends than me. I'm gonna assume that if you've made it to this point in the video, you're a very cool person. Seriously. I mean, you're willing to listen to some idiot rant about James Bond games, so I like you. But even if that was the solution for it, was split screen, a game like Quantum of Solace got the short end of the stick on this generation as Activision shut down the multiplayer servers, didn't include bots like in their other games, and didn't include the ability to play split screen multiplayer. Bit of a tongue twister there. There is no local split screen multiplayer on Quantum of Solace. No multiplayer locally, no bots, no online. You know what that means? No multiplayer. There's a smaller group of fans still keeping this game alive with their own server. I'm not personally sure how they do it. I don't always understand the back end of fan-made servers, and it's cool, it's awesome. But again, that's a fan solution to something that should have been done by official channels. The preservation should be coming from the top. These games should be kept alive by the people who actually have the ability to do so, not just the fans having to pick up the slack. And it's really too bad because this generation did still have a lot of fans of Bond. I like these games as well, and while I do prefer the more gadget-oriented Bond games, a game like Bloodstone also had a very interesting and original Bond storyline that I think tons of people will never really experience. You can go watch the games, sure, and I run a Let's Play channel myself, so if you're interested in the Let's Play channel, Degenerate Plays in the description down below, and I think it's a ton of fun. But even me, who runs a Let's Play channel and has fun with it, will admit it is a different experience watching a Let's Play than it is holding a controller in your hands. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other, but it's still frustrating that a lot of people don't have the option anymore. And while people will actually argue about the canon status of these games, and they do feature a lot of different styles of gameplay based on Daniel Craig's Bond, I will say that I always considered the original Bond stories, not the movie adaptations, but the original Bond stories, to be basically related to each actor and vaguely fall in the canon of their era. I know some people don't think so. That's totally fine. I do respect that as well. MGM never really denied or confirmed this. They were officially licensed products, and I figure it's always just been more stories to enjoy regardless, either way, no matter how you look at it. The Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii U generation also has another slap to the face for Bond fans, and that is it's in more ways than one. It's 007 Legends. Now, I'm not going to spend the next few minutes just ragging on this game, but I will say that it was widely criticized for being a COD clone that ham-fisted Daniel Craig's rendition of Bond into classic Bond scenes without the charm of their respective movies. Now, that said, I don't think a game has to be amazing to deserve preservation. Just like I don't have to go to a museum and love art to still want it to exist in the museum. I still believe these pieces of media are art forms and that players should be able to access them later on and be able to play them. What's frustrating to me is not only did Legends also never get ported up to newer generations through backwards compatibility or anything else, it also didn't feature multiplayer bots and had a no longer accessible DLC based off of the movie Skyfall after it was delisted. This DLC is now only usable if people downloaded it in the past and it's in their download history. They can re-download it because there are ways to do that on these older generations of tech. Or if they have the Wii U version of the game, which I do own, where it's oddly found on the disc. Now again, this entire generation of games has been left on their respective hardwares, but they also don't even have bot support for local multiplayers, and Quantum doesn't even have a local multiplayer at all. We're at pretty much the end of the video, and you may be thinking, wow, what other games is he going to bring up? And while there are some I didn't talk about, like the Wii and DS versions of Quantum of Solace, the Game Boy 007 game, and the much lauded GoldenEye Rogue Agent, which I wanted to reach the end of the video without really mentioning, I will say did have a fun multiplayer at the very least, the point really comes down to this. There has been no real effort by rights holders to allow these games to move forward and live on after their first few years of existence. With a lot of these games, even TV technology has changed and moved past generations of consoles that the games are stuck on, and emulation's not always a perfect solution for the games, with some of them still having problems. And that's if we were going to give a pass to the official channels for not making it available. I still believe that while fans are doing a fantastic job making it available, it's frustrating that we have to rely on that and not official channels to see these things live on. Especially now that we're in the age of remasters and re-releases every other week, it's very odd to not see these games live on. The more modern games also lack bots, like I've mentioned multiple times, to simulate actual online gameplay in place of the servers that have long been shut down, and the digital listings for these games that were available are long gone. It's a really frustrating situation to me as a big Bond fan, because regardless of the quality of some of these games, with me wanting to play more, some of them more than others, there's certainly ones I don't want to spend much time on. Whether you think they're good or bad, I still believe they deserve to continue to exist, and fans of James Bond should be able to access and pay for them and play them without having to rely on the goodwill and generosity of gaming enthusiasts and emulation experts in order to play a video game that was released years ago. This attitude would be considered unacceptable for movies or music, for it to just be lost to time and ditched. I don't understand why people feel separately for video games. I know that control schemes are updated over time, I know that graphics improve over time, but that doesn't mean that the enjoyment is gone or that the art form should just be abandoned because it's old. I really find that to be a ridiculous ideology to hold on to, but it's one that seems to be embraced by a lot of people and a lot of corporations now, and it's really affected the James Bond franchise of games and just does nothing but frustrate me. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I do plan to cover a lot more James Bond stuff. I know this was longer, but it's something that really matters to me. I have a lot of passion for game preservation. I really want to see games continue to exist. If you stuck it out to this point, again, you're probably pretty cool, so I hope you'll check out the Let's Play channel, Degenerate Plays, in the link down below, and that's in the description. So I hope to see you over there. Have a fantastic day, everyone, and as always, stay shway. Huge thank you to some of my patrons like Michael, Jaden, Jason, Mark, Vince, Sean, Colin, and Jonah for making videos like this possible. I appreciate you very much. YouTube is a fickle master, and my channel in particular in the last few years has had a really hard time gaining traction and going anywhere unless I talk about one or two specific things. So it means a lot to me that you guys are willing to actually support what I do here. I appreciate you very much. Thank you so much. And if you're interested in the Patreon, the link to that is in the description down below. I'll see you later, guys.